Hey folks, in this video we're going to talk about the biochemical families, and we're going to start with a quick discussion of carbon. Carbon is special. Carbon is special because it's the backbone for all organic molecules, and when a chemist says organic, they're talking about carbon-based chemistry. So we're not talking about organic like organic food. We're talking about molecules that are based on carbon chains, and biochemistry is one tiny little branch of organic chemistry. Now, biochemicals are what we call polymers. They're big molecules that are chains of smaller molecules. So a polymer would look like this, right, where you've got tiny molecules strung together in a chain. That's a polymer, and each one of these little links in the chain we would call a monomer. So a monomer is one small molecule that makes up a polymer. The first family of biochemicals is the carbohydrates, and you can tell, well, first of all, carbohydrates are the sugars and the starches, and you can always tell on a food label, you can tell on a food label that some of the foods are sugars because they're going to end in OSE. So if you see galactose on a label, that means you're dealing with a sugar. Sugars are either monosaccharides or disaccharides, and these are the monomers of the carbohydrates. So small little rings of carbon, like glucose, are the monosaccharides, and then if you string two of those together, you get disaccharides. Starches are going to be the long chains of these sugars. So the polymer here is the polysaccharide, which is commonly called a starch. Sugars, the main purpose is energy. Don't forget they also, though, can be structural, like in plants. Cellulose is actually a structural carbohydrate. Its purpose is not to provide a plant with energy. Its purpose is actually to provide a rigid structure to the cell wall of plants. Another important starch that you need to know about is glycogen in animals. This is a starch that is found in the muscles. It's there as just a usable energy source for animals in their muscles. So those times where you have a fight or flight reaction, the energy to power your muscles in that quick instant comes from glycogen. You can tell that you're looking at a carbohydrate if you just have a chemical formula, because you have this basic structure that you see here at the bottom. You have 2 times as much hydrogen as you have oxygen and carbon. So you get a formula C sub x, H sub 2x, O sub x. So carbohydrates tend to have formulas like C6H12O6, C11H22O11, and so on. Think of the carbohydrates in general like an energy checking account. So this is not going to be long-term energy. This is short-term energy. The sugars generally get burned pretty fast. If not, they get stored as starches, and those starches are really not meant to be a place where you store energy for a long period of time. Here are a couple pictures of a monosaccharide. This is glucose. This is what glucose looks like, and this is what we're talking about, this ring structure here of glucose. This is a ring of carbons. You can string 2 monosaccharides together to get a disaccharide. Once you start stringing more than that together, that's what we call the polysaccharide. So this is what a starch would look like. And remember that some starches can be really complex, so off to the side of the starch you might have another chain of sugar molecules, and you could have branching chains and so on. So these can get really complex and really large. The next big family of biochemicals is the lipids. The lipids are the fats, oils, and waxes, and the main purpose of lipids is going to be long-term energy storage. So this is like the energy savings account. So when energy is stored as a lipid, it's stored there with the intention of it being for the long haul. The monomer here is the fatty acid. So the building block of lipids is fatty acids. These don't get strung together in a chain. They get strung together in an E-shaped molecule that we call a triglyceride, and the tri is there because there are 3 fatty acids in a triglyceride. The secondary use of these molecules is waterproofing and insulation. So fats are really great at waterproofing skin, for example. That's why otters are kind of greasy. They're oily because they are in and out of the water so much that the oil on their skin is for waterproofing. And whales are blubbery because they live in cold water, and so they need that insulation, the extra layer of fat, to keep them warm. Now, these are the close chemical cousins of the carbohydrates because they're made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, just like the carbohydrates. But lipids don't have that formula, that C sub X, H sub 2X, O sub X. So lipids are a little different. But because they are close chemical cousins, it's very easy to take a carbohydrate and convert it to a lipid, which is why low-carb diets became popular, because people were eating a bunch of sugars but also eating low fat, and they thought, well, I should be losing weight. But what happens is when you don't burn carbohydrates and when you try to store excess energy from carbohydrates in starches in your body, there's only so much capacity for starch storage. So once the starch storage is full, then your body's going to take those carbohydrates, convert them to lipids, and store them in your fat cells. Speaking of lipids, here is what a saturated fatty acid would look like. Remember, saturated means that on the main carbon chain there are only single bonds. Now, yes, I see this right here, right? In organic chemistry, you have what are called functional groups, and this COOH means that this is an organic acid. We don't count this double bond as being an unsaturation point. So it's saturated, the fatty acid is saturated because all of the bonds on the main chain are single bonds. On the second molecule that you see, again, this is a functional group, okay? But notice on the main chain here, right in the middle is a double bond. Remember, when you introduce a double or triple bond, we call that unsaturated, because this is a point where you're not full of hydrogens, right? This is a point where you could break one of these bonds and stuff some more hydrogens into this molecule. So remember, saturated means full of hydrogen, and in this case, this molecule is not full of hydrogen. Here's the triglyceride. So here's a backbone of glycerol, and you can see the 3 fatty acid chains coming off the side. These are all saturated fatty acids that are coming off, but you don't have to always have saturated fatty acids. Sometimes you can have like one chain that has some unsaturated points in it. Also notice that this is the E-shaped molecule that I was talking about, right? Okay, there's our capital E there. So those are the lipids. Some other types of lipids, these are the fats that we've mainly talked about, but don't forget about the cholesterols, like or the sterols like cholesterol, which is a wax, and also things like earwax, beeswax, those are all lipids, they're all waxes. Okay, the next group is proteins. The building blocks of the proteins are the amino acids, so these are the monomers, and the type of bond here has a special name in proteins. It's called a peptide bond. So peptide bonds hold together proteins, or hold together the amino acids to make the proteins. With proteins, you're going to start seeing some new molecule or atoms coming up. Proteins are going to be made of the carbon and hydrogen and oxygen, just like you saw before, but for the first time, you're going to start seeing phosphorus come up, and you're also going to see nitrogen, and the big one here is nitrogen. Nitrogen is on the backbone of an amino acid molecule, and I'll show you that in a sec. The order of the amino acids becomes important because now you don't have these repeating segments like you used to have in the carbohydrates and lipids. You're gonna see with amino acids they have what's called a side chain, and that side chain is going to determine whether or not the molecule is going to bend or fold in a certain way. And that's going to determine the overall shape of a protein molecule. And the shape determines how the protein works, especially when you get to enzymes. In terms of uses, these have a lot of uses in the body. These are the workhorses of the body. They're there for immunity, right? That's what your antibodies are made of, proteins. They're there for structure. They're there for cell communication, marking, and even transport. And then the big one that we have another video about is enzymes. They act as enzymes as well. All right, so here's what an amino acid looks like. Now this is flipped from how we drew it in class, but notice that you've got carbon, right, hydrogen and oxygen, okay? But here is where nitrogen first makes its appearance. And then, of course, you have this little R group here. R group is the side chain, and remember, this varies from amino acid to amino acid. And there are 20 amino acids that make up the proteins of all living things. And some of these R groups are just a hydrogen. Sometimes there's a ring of carbons, sometimes there's a chain of carbons, and so on. So the type of amino acid that you're dealing with here is based on what the side chain is. So this basic part here, this other part that's all carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen, that is the main part of the amino acid, and it's going to be the same from amino acid to amino acid. This R group is what you're going to see different. And just to give you an idea, these are the 20 amino acids and what their R groups look like. No, I do not expect you to memorize them. But you can see every amino acid has something different at its side chain, at that R group. Some of them are what we call polar, meaning they have a partial charge on them. Some of them are non-polar. Some of them actually have electrical charges on them, so they can actually be fully positive or negative. And again, knowing that opposites attract and negatives repel, you can kind of start to see that if you string together amino acids in such a way that, say, you've got some positive side chains side by side, you're going to start to see the molecule kind of bending so that those side chains don't come into contact. And then maybe if down the way, you've got a negative side chain, you can see that the molecule is going to kind of fold itself over so that the negative and the positives come into contact with one another, and that's going to determine the shape. Finally, the last group are the nucleic acids, and the nucleic acids are DNA and RNA. That's what we're looking at. These have one function, and their function is heredity. In other words, they're the code for how to build you, and they are what passes on to your children when you reproduce. The monomers of the nucleic acids are nucleotides, and nucleotides have three parts. They have a phosphate, a sugar, and a base. And you may have heard the letters A, T, G, and C. Those are the bases that you find in DNA, and then in RNA, this little U1 replaces the T1. The order of the nucleotides is what's going to contain the code for the molecule itself.